It was a cold, gray November day, and I was standing in a vacant lot in Chicago, the wind cutting through me, looking around. Small pieces of charred wood and soot-covered dry plaster mixed with shards of broken glass littered the ground, and small pieces of debris whistled across the vacant lot, driven by the merciless wind. I thought the scene was a fitting metaphor for what my life had become. A scorched, empty shell of what it once was, cold and desolate. A monument to loneliness, bitterness, and failure. I kicked a piece of concrete and continued to ponder what I could do with what I had left. I met Olivia at a charity event a few weeks after my 29th birthday. At the time, I was second in command at the family retail business, and my great-uncle Seth, the majority shareholder and CEO, had advised me to attend the event to support the family, make friends, and perhaps start my own business. The event was boring to the extreme, full of overly dramatic, self-satisfied people who thought that by raising a few $1,000s for a local library, they were Mother Teresa. I tried to be polite, nodding, smiling distractedly, sometimes biting my tongue until it bled, and desperately hoping I could leave early when she quietly sank into the chair next to me, lit me up with a 1,000-watt smile, and started talking like an old friend. Olivia was a petite, graceful, slender girl with bronze skin and chestnut hair who radiated confidence and ease, and suddenly I didn't mind participating in the fundraiser at all. I had always been a fairly ambitious and competitive guy in school, at work, and in sports, but I never felt particularly comfortable in social situations. Ever since business school, I had been more or less married to my job, and that, combined with my innate social awkwardness, made it doubly difficult for me to interact with women. Because of my shyness, I almost never asked women out on dates unless I had known them for a long time, but Olivia seemed irresistible to me, and by the end of the evening I asked her out to dinner. We had a great time and, contrary to my fears, discovered that we had common interests and lots to talk about. I quickly fell in love with her, and the feeling was mutual. By the time I drove her home, it was clear that we would be seeing each other often. We dated for a couple of months, and our relationship was gaining momentum. Soon we were seeing each other several times a week and spending a lot of time together. She clearly liked me, and I was more than interested in getting her into bed, but I had no idea how to make the next move without risking a painful rejection or even scaring her away forever. I wasn't a virgin, but I didn't have much experience with women, and I always thought that lust was a male thing. Olivia easily dispelled my doubts. Up until that moment, it was the most enjoyable thing I had ever done. From that moment on, intimacy became frequent and easy as our relationship deepened. A few months later, we moved in together, and a little over a year after we met, we got married. We moved into a 4-bedroom house in a beautiful, tree-lined neighborhood, did some landscaping, got a dog, and life became very, very good. I loved almost everything about being married. The end of the loneliness I didn't want to admit, the unconditional emotional support, the physical satisfaction of meaningful sex, and having someone I loved who loved me back. It was everything I wanted and more. Of course, there were difficulties. I was always a little stressed at work, so Olivia was a little disappointed with my availability, and I guess there were a few other habits of mine that annoyed her a little. Naturally, there were a few things that annoyed me too. Probably the biggest problem was that we had to interact with her family much more often than I would have liked. Don't get me wrong, I didn't dislike her family. They were nice, decent people, generally polite and without any particularly unpleasant traits, but I just didn't want to spend a lot of time with them. Her parents were a sociable, friendly couple, and they seemed to like me, but they often lectured us on how we should live our lives and put pressure on us to have children. But we didn't spend enough time together for it to bother me much, so it wasn't a big deal. Her younger sister, Mindy, and her husband were a little more problematic for me. Mindy was shorter and a little heavier than Olivia. She dressed like Olivia, talked like Olivia, and when Olivia was around, she never strayed more than a few minutes away from her. They were like Siamese twins, whispering, laughing at inside jokes, and shamelessly gossiping about friends and family. And since she and her husband lived 15 minutes away, we spent quite a bit of time together. Maybe there was nothing wrong with that, or maybe it was jealousy, but when she was with Mindy, she wasn't really with me, and that couldn't help but be disappointing. Mindy's husband didn't help matters. He was a tall, blonde, handsome guy named Bruce, friendly, easygoing, and, in my opinion, not very smart. He had inherited the family furniture store in Joliet, and it was his favorite, and sometimes only, topic of conversation. He talked about the store as if it were Microsoft and he were Bill Gates, bragging about how well things were going and how no one else in the furniture business knew what they were doing. The problem with this way of thinking was that the store was struggling, and I was sure that anyone with even a little business sense could see that part of the problem was Bruce himself. But I wanted peace, and I wanted Olivia to be happy, and that meant not causing problems in her family, so I spent many evenings mindlessly nodding and listening to Bruce. We had been married for almost 2 years when Olivia first asked me to help Mindy and Bruce. She had prepared a luxurious dinner with candles and romantic music, and dressed in a way that promised a pleasant night in bed, so, like a typical young husband, I thought she just wanted to have some fun with me. But as the evening progressed, it became clear that she had other plans. She talked endlessly about how lucky we were to have such a high income and how she thought we could help others. Then, with a look of practical suffering on her face, she confessed how worried she was about Mindy and Bruce, who were barely making ends meet. It turned out that Bruce owed a certain amount of money and couldn't pay it back, and without help, he wouldn't be able to replenish his supplies. I quickly realized where she was going with this and got down to business. "How much do they want for Liv?" She fell silent and raised her eyebrows, letting me know that I had ruined her plans. She bit her lip, thought for a moment, and then looked shyly into my eyes. "He needs 50 or 60,000. That will allow them to pay off their debts and start a new life." I almost choked. Yes, business was good, but most of my money was tied up in a family trust, and that kind of money would have a serious impact on our cash flow. I knew I could get the money from the fund if it was really needed, but I didn't want to explain that to Bernie Blackman, our general counsel, who also handled the fund. He would have done what I asked, but I knew he would have hounded me to get the money back in the near future. He wasn't cruel. He just took his job of protecting the fund's money and the business very seriously. After thinking about it, I tried to brush off Olivia's sincere request, the only one she had ever made in our entire marriage. "I don't know, Liv. It's a lot of money." She frowned. "Mindy says he has great ideas and that they'll pay off right away." "They're good for money if that's what you're worried about. I'm sure they are." Well, I wasn't sure about that. In fact, I was sure I'd be throwing a significant amount of money down the drain if I sent it to Bruce. But I wanted Olivia to be happy, so I decided not to risk it and wrote a check for 60,000, telling Olivia firmly that it meant we'd have to live off our savings for a while until the money came back. I once heard some advice that if you lend money to relatives, you have to understand that you won't see it again. This sets you up emotionally so that the relationship isn't ruined if they don't pay you back. So, in my opinion, it was a gift. A $60,000 gift to Olivia's sister and her relatively incompetent brother-in-law, who I didn't think would solve their problem because I knew he wasn't a good enough businessman to turn their store around, even with that money. I wasn't happy, but I wanted to be a good person for her and her family. I wanted them to love me, and I was willing to give up $60,000 for that. 3 or 4 months after I lent Bruce the money, I was at home looking for a flash drive with important data on it. I had a bad habit of absent-mindedly putting important things in unusual places, so I practically turned the whole house upside down. After checking all the usual places, I wandered into the guest room, looked around the desk, and even looked under the bed. When I got up there, I noticed that the bed was unusually soft, at least by Olivia's standards, and was clearly more messy than it should have been after my brief search. It was obvious that someone had slept in it and hastily pulled the sheets and blanket over themselves without making the bed properly. At the time, it didn't seem particularly important, but later that evening, I mentioned it to Olivia in passing. "Hey, did anyone sleep in the guest bed? I went in there earlier and it was pretty messy." Olivia stammered in response and looked flushed and nervous. Um, um, well, um, I took a nap there earlier. I'm sorry. I was cleaning up and I was so tired that I just jumped into bed and didn't have time to tidy up." At that point in our marriage, I trusted Olivia so much that the thought that her explanation could be anything other than the plain truth didn't even cross my mind. In fact, I remember thinking it was funny that she was nervous or embarrassed about having slept during the day. But the blanket wasn't the only clue I missed. Over the next year, several other strange and inexplicable things happened that, if I hadn't been so blind, might have indicated that Olivia was not a paragon of virtue. For example, I accepted at face value that her usually quiet job as an assistant manager at a small independent bookstore suddenly required her to attend 5 to 6 hour meetings every Tuesday without fail. The meetings were so important that I wasn't supposed to try to contact her during that time. I also accepted any explanation for the small bruises on her body, some of which were in relatively intimate places or for underwear in the laundry that I didn't remember her wearing. And then there was the orange juice incident. Olivia started shopping at a new upscale grocery store, which in itself wasn't a big deal, except that she couldn't buy many of the things I liked, including my favorite brand of orange juice. I complained about it and asked her to switch stores, but she insisted that the new store was better and much more convenient for her, as it was right on her way home from Tuesday meetings. Her choice of grocery store was hardly a clear sign of infidelity, but it was this piece of information that made me wonder, which ultimately led to a revelation that broke my heart. Less than 18 months after the first loan, Olivia began hinting that Bruce and Mindy might need more money. By that point, he hadn't paid back a single cent of the original $60,000, and I didn't want to give any more money, especially to support a business I didn't think was viable. So I brushed off Olivia's offer, hoping she would get the hint and stop asking. But she persisted, saying that Mindy and Bruce could lose their business if they couldn't upgrade it and expand their product line. Still trying to be Mr. Popular, I felt I couldn't say no outright, so I finally agreed to look at Bruce's business plan and visit his store to see what he wanted to do. I hoped Olivia would let it go if I could at least convince myself it was a bad investment. On Monday morning, I met Bruce at his store, and with his usual unbridled enthusiasm, he showed me around the store, showed me the floor plan, introduced me to the staff, and smiled and patted me on the back like an old friend when we stopped to talk. To someone, he told me about his business plan and said with great confidence and sincerity that he was sure a little money to improve the product range and a few upgrades would quickly bring the store into significant profit. Bruce and I sat in his office for half an hour, and I shared my doubts with him. As diplomatically as possible, I let him know that, in my opinion, the business had some pretty serious problems. I hinted that unless he could optimize and reduce costs and prices, he was unlikely to really increase customer interest and revenue, even with the changes he wanted to make. I even very cautiously suggested that he consider selling the business and looking for another job, but he took great offense and repeated that he was confident that a small update would be enough to turn things around. I didn't have the heart to refuse him the money, so I explained that I didn't have enough personal funds to give him a large loan, and that the money would have to come from a trust fund. I said I would talk to Bernie and see if he could work out the loan, but I couldn't promise anything. My plan was to avoid conflict and at least give the impression that I was making every legitimate effort to get him the money before breaking the bad news and essentially blaming Bernie for turning him down. I know it was cowardly, but I wanted to keep the peace in the family and wasn't willing to lose that much money. To tell the truth, Bernie would have done anything I asked him to, but I had always impressed upon everyone I knew that he was responsible for controlling the trust, and I couldn't overrule his decisions. It may seem unfair to make Bernie look bad, but to be honest, I think he enjoyed the role and never complained to me about it. At the end of the conversation, Bruce nodded and smiled broadly, letting me know that he believed he would get what he deserved. He shook my hand firmly, patted me on the back again, which made me feel even more guilty, and drove away. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed for the highway, thinking about my meeting with Bruce and trying to justify my cowardice and near dishonesty in his store. I was driving along, not paying much attention to my surroundings, when I saw something that at first seemed like a strange coincidence, but then made me feel vaguely uneasy. It was a grocery store, smaller than most of the big chain stores, painted green, with a large sign that read Salvador's. It looked so unusual that I was sure I had never seen anything like it before, but for some reason the name reminded me of something, and I couldn't quite place it. I thought about it for a few minutes before it finally dawned on me. Salvador's was the name of the store where Olivia had started shopping. The store that didn't have my favorite orange juice and was much easier to get to. Only it wasn't near her work, our house, or any other place she might have been during the week, so it didn't make sense that this store was convenient for her errands on Tuesdays, unless, of course, she did them at the furniture store. Thinking about it, I began to come up with several disturbing possibilities. I turned around, drove past Salvador's, and returned to Bruce's furniture store, where I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. I took out my cell phone and made sure it was the only Salvador's in Chicago, then spent 15 or 20 minutes thinking about possible reasons why she might be shopping there. I considered the possibility that Olivia had another office in the area, that she might have been meeting Mindy for lunch, that maybe she frequented a fitness club or something like that in the neighborhood. But my thoughts kept coming back to the conclusion I didn't want to accept. I suddenly wanted to know more, and as soon as possible, so I decided to take the bull by the horns and meet Bruce face to face. I jumped out of the car and quickly made my way to the front door of the furniture store, where I noticed a clock on the glass showing that the store was open until 8 p.m. on weekdays, except Tuesdays, when it closed at noon. The suspicion that had arisen a few minutes ago continued to grow. Slamming the door, I entered the store and headed for the first employee I saw, a rather awkward middle-aged man stirring coffee in a cup. Excuse me, but... Excuse me, but I'm on my break, he interrupted me irritably. Listen, I don't want to take up your time, but I need to speak to Bruce McCoy immediately. I was discussing some important financial matters with him, and I need some additional information. I looked at him expectantly, but he continued stirring his coffee and even took a sip, ignoring my request. One of the reasons they couldn't ship the goods became clear, and I paused, stunned, before speaking again, this time in a more insistent tone. Seriously, this is very important. Could you bring him to me? He looked at me warily, but finally a look of recognition appeared on his face. You're the guy who was here earlier with Bruce, right? Yes, come on in. Bruce is meeting with the supplier right now, but you can wait for him in the break room if you like. I don't think he'll be long. Half an hour at most. He slowly led me back into the room and left me with a cup of coffee and the TV remote. I quickly came up with a plan. Meet with Bruce and tell him that I had irrefutable proof that he was cheating on her with Olivia. I threatened that if he didn't confess immediately, the evidence would reach Mindy and the rest of the family. I decided that if Bruce was really cheating on her, he would break down immediately, and if not, I would have to live with the shame. Maybe I'd just joke about it or something. I paced around the room, rehearsing how I would tell her that I had photos or a recording, or even that Olivia had confessed to me. As I thought about the confrontation ahead, I began to look around the room distractedly. I rummaged through some magazines and flipped through a few TV channels before deciding to look for evidence. It gradually dawned on me that if they had used the store to commit fraud, it was highly likely that it had happened in this recreation room. And if they had done it here, they had almost certainly used the worn-out sofa I was looking at. For a minute or two, I stared at the couch with anger and trepidation. It was faded green with a couple of coffee stains and a tear in one of the armrests. It had clearly seen better days and was probably more suited to a dump or a thrift store. I pulled the pillow toward me and my pulse quickened slightly when I saw that it was a fold-out bed with sheets. I quickly checked that Bruce was still in his office, then made the bed. The sheets were in disarray, crumpled, with a couple of slightly darkened, yellowed patches exactly where the wet spot should have been. There was a lipstick stain on the bed, and a faint scent of perfume wafted from it. Opening the bed, I saw trash on the floor under the sofa, so I reached my right hand into the space above the bed and, straining, pulled out a dirty rug, pulling items out of it one by one. Finally, I pulled out a pen, 37 cents and change, a broken coffee cup, an empty jelly tube, and a restaurant receipt. The receipt was from a Mexican restaurant where Olivia liked to have lunch, and at the bottom was her signature, smooth, elegant, and incriminating. Looking back, I realized that the check was only weak circumstantial evidence that could easily be explained away with any story or excuse. But somehow, finding it finally pushed all the unpleasant oddities of her Tuesday schedule, the bruises, the use of underwear, and the mess in the bed out of my head. And it all came together into a clear picture of a cheating wife and a shitty brother-in-law. Suddenly, my plan to scare Bruce into confessing seemed like a bad idea. I needed clear evidence of the affair, and I realized that confrontation could ruin everything if I didn't make it impossible to prove. But now, knowing the time and place of their likely affair, I could almost certainly gather the information, the proof I needed to be sure. I slid out of bed and sat down on the sofa, agitated, my heart pounding in my chest, my teeth clenched. I had been cheated in business deals several times. I remember being cheated at cards once, but I had never experienced such betrayal in my life. I was on the verge of screaming, crying, yelling, and punching the wall all at once. But gradually, out of this emotional whirlwind, a burning desire began to emerge. A desire for revenge. I calmed down a little and began to think about my situation, trying to be as objective and impartial as possible. I thought about Bruce's weaknesses and my wife's weaknesses and how I could use those weaknesses to satisfy my wounded pride once I had solid proof. My first fantasy was to beat Bruce up, but I realized that would only land me in jail. My second thought was to call off the loan and demand immediate repayment of all the money. But I remembered what Bernie had told me when I was considering taking out a loan from one of the more aggressive banks. He talked me out of it, saying that if you owe someone money, especially someone who doesn't wish you well. They have you by the balls. And I needed Bruce. I looked into Bruce's office again and saw him standing there, shaking hands with a supplier. I waved and smiled, he waved back, escorted the supplier to the door, and then hurried back to the break room. Hey Mike, did you forget something? Do you need any more information? I shook my head and smiled. Listen, Bruce, I've thought about it and I want to tell you that maybe I gave you the wrong impression today. I really hope you understand that I think you're an excellent businessman and that I think this store is a real success for you. But as I was leaving, I realized that I may have misspoken when I asked about your plans in case things didn't work out the way you wanted them to. He smiled in response. Oh no, Mike, I understand. Any good businessman asks tough questions. Okay. I just want you to know that I really like what you're doing here. Besides, you're part of my family. And I need to feel that this isn't just a sound investment, but the right decision for you as a friend and family member, as well as a good businessman. So I didn't want you to leave without knowing for sure that I'm going to do everything I can to get that money for you. And I can't imagine that we won't get it. As I said, I don't have that kind of money in my personal accounts, so I'll have to ask for the money to be withdrawn from the trust fund. But honestly, I'm confident I can talk Bernie into it, and we'll get that money for you. Bruce listened with an expectant smile on his face, which grew wider as I spoke. Oh man, that sounds great, I'm telling you. This business is on the verge of taking off, so this loan is as safe for me as it is for the bank. You have nothing to worry about. I'm not worried at all, Bruce. Bernie will have to draw up some kind of agreement, of course, because he'll insist on protecting the trust with collateral and so on. I should have everything sorted out within a few days. If you have no objections, I think you'll have the money in a week. The next morning, I walked into Bernie's office, closed the door, and sank into a chair. Bernie was on the phone, taking notes, and he raised his finger to indicate that he would be available shortly. I fidgeted noticeably when he finished his conversation, and he obviously noticed because, after hanging up, he gave me a puzzled look and asked, Well, Mike, what's got you so nervous this morning? I cleared my throat and leaned forward slightly to speak. Bernie, I'm going to need access to the trust fund to get a pretty large loan. Yeah, I think that's no problem. What kind of, what kind of loan? And for how much? He turned on his computer, clicked on a couple of icons, and opened a spreadsheet with information about the trust funds. I cleared my throat and leaned in closer. Listen, Bernie, before we start drawing up the paperwork, I want you to promise me absolute confidentiality. Of course, I always... No, listen, I want you to understand that this is unusual, and you might be tempted to talk to Seth or someone else here at work, or someone in your family. I don't want anyone but you and me to know what I'm about to do. He shifted in his chair, frowned, and after a moment's hesitation began to respond. Mike, if this is illegal, it's not illegal, not at all. In fact, I want you to draw up a document that will be a model of legal perfection. He shook his head, and I continued. I want to borrow some money. I want you to draw up the loan documents. I want the terms of the loan to be very clear. I want the loan to be properly secured by the very business I plan to give it to. And I want the penalties for non-payment to be very, very clearly spelled out. It sounds like you're expecting default. It's like you're trying to set the guy up. More or less. So who are you trying to set up and why? I paused for a moment before answering, then looked him straight in the eye. I want to trap my brother-in-law, Bruce. Why, Olivia? He raised his eyebrows in surprise and opened his mouth several times to respond, but didn't say a word. Finally, he took a sip of water from the glass on the table and cleared his throat. Are you, sure about this? Very, I replied. Very. A week later, the document was drafted, and I personally took it to Bruce to read and sign. He asked his lawyer, a modest young man named Tim Sawers, who happened to be his cousin, to sit down with us and go over the document. Okay, Sowers began. I read it last night, and it's pretty much what I expected for a business loan. But there are a couple of things I'd like to point out to you, Bruce, before you sign it, okay? Bruce, as always, smiled without emotion, agreeing and understanding nothing. Sure, go ahead, Tim. Sowers cleared his throat and looked intently at Bruce. I thought I saw a flash of contempt in his eyes, as if he knew how little Bruce understood about running a business. So, first things first. This $425,000 loan will be repaid over 7 years. You have a fairly standard interest rate, Payments will start immediately at just over $6,000 a month. Bruce nodded. Actually, you'll only get $365,000 because we're combining that with the loan you took out a couple of years ago. Mike will get his $60,000, and you'll get the rest. Everything clear? Capiche, Bruce replied smugly with a slight Italian accent. Tim looked at him again and sighed quietly. All right then. The loan is secured. It's tied to your business as well as the property in Keokuk. Is that a quagmire? Yes, Bruce pointed to Bernie, who was talking to Sars. They, want to make sure that Mike's trust is protected if the business fails. He wrinkled his nose for a moment, then quickly added, but that won't happen. The business is in great shape. I think so. And Bernie Black seems to think so too. He nodded in my direction and smiled. And Mike, of course, thinks so. Right, Mike? Oh, yes, I replied with maximum enthusiasm. Bruce showed me the books and I think he'll be fine. I smiled. But I don't know if you know Bernie, but he's very, very conservative and always considers the worst-case scenario. He wants to be absolutely sure that the trust is protected, so it's important to him that if some kind of impossible business collapse happens, he has something to compensate the trust for its losses. Sowers frowned, then looked intently at Bruce. You do realize that in the event of default, you could lose the business invested in the trust? Maybe even the duck hunting grounds? They've been in our family for a very long time. Of course. Bruce spoke seriously, perhaps trying to let Sars know that he understood the warning and took it very seriously. I understand there will be consequences. There's no question about that. But, to be honest, I'm very confident in this business and believe that taking this loan is much safer than trying to run the business without it. You do realize that penalties will start accruing 3 months after the first missed payment, right? Of course I do. He smiled at me as if we shared a secret, as if he knew I would never let Bernie collect the penalties, except in the most egregious cases. I just smiled back. At home, Olivia was beside herself with joy. She talked non-stop about how well things would go for Bruce now that he had enough money to solve his major problems. Somehow, I managed not to say what I wanted to say, that the main problem was Bruce himself, and no amount of money would solve it. But over the next few weeks, keeping quiet about Bruce's business acumen was the easiest thing to do when I was around Olivia. I needed to gather more information to break up the marriage the way I wanted. And that took time, so I knew I had to control my emotions, which fluctuated daily from melancholy to rage to disgust at the thought of her cheating on me. Having dinner with her without exploding became a real challenge, and sex became something I tried to avoid if possible. When I was 18, my friends and I went to San Diego for spring break. One night, we went to Tijuana to let loose. We got drunk and ended up in the company of prostitutes. Somehow, I found myself with a girl in her 30s who, from the looks of it, had had a pretty rough life. She wasn't particularly attractive, and probably even worse than I remembered, considering that my perception of beauty was undoubtedly distorted by a fairly high level of alcohol in my blood. But even though I was drunk as a skunk, I seriously doubted whether I should take her to bed, and started making excuses to try to talk myself out of it. But my friends wouldn't let me leave, questioning my masculinity, sexual orientation, and everything else. Feeling like I had no choice, I put on a fake smile, quickly downed a couple more drinks, gritted my teeth, and followed her into the damp, unkempt room above the bar to get down to business. Unsurprisingly, Olivia noticed the change and eventually mentioned it, complaining that she wanted something romantic. In another life, she probably would have made good money off American tourists in Tijuana. Getting solid proof of the affair wasn't as easy as I thought. Bruce had spent some of the money on minor repairs to the shop, and there were quite a few workers there during the day, fixing things. I correctly assumed that no one would notice an electrician with $500 of my money in his pocket, installing a camera and a recording device in one of the lamps above the sofa in the break room on Monday morning, about a month after Bruce received the money, and then removing them again 2 days later. Now, I had a pretty good idea of what Bruce and Olivia were up to, so I decided I was ready for what I was going to see on the camera. I decided to sit in my office with some drinks and chips and watch it all as casually as possible, like a movie. It turned out that seeing your wife having fun with another man is much worse than just knowing it's happening. Much, much worse. By the end of the recording, I had drunk so much whiskey that I couldn't make it home, trashed my desk, threw up twice, and threw the press kit at my office door. The details are pretty much as you'd expect. I fast-forwarded to Tuesday evening, and started watching the recording at double speed until I saw a woman in a blue dress with a large bag suddenly enter the room, take fresh sheets out of the bag, and spread them on the sofa. I immediately slowed the recording down to normal speed and saw with grim confirmation that the woman was indeed Olivia. When Bruce finally entered the room, Olivia put down her book, smiled, and stood up to hug him. And then it became clear what had happened. A few minutes passed, and I leaned over to turn off the video when I noticed that they had started talking, leaning against the pillow. Olivia was lying on her side, propping her head up and resting her right hand on her elbows. They looked at each other, talking quietly and smiling. Olivia began to complain quietly about having to use a furniture store as their love nest. Bruce rolled onto his side and replied, "Come on, Liv. If we use a hotel, we'll leave traces, and when we used one of our houses, we almost got caught. We really don't have any other choice." Olivia shrugged. I know, but I would really like to have another place to play. I just don't like this room, and I'm not inspired by the thought of having to change dirty sheets from last week before we make love." Bruce reached out and stroked her cheek, smiling. "Well, we could always just run away together." Olivia laughed, and Bruce frowned thoughtfully, his smile fading a little. "Seriously, Liv, have you ever regretted marrying Mike? I love Mindy, and she's a good wife, but sometimes I wonder if you think it would have been better if we had gotten married instead." Olivia climbed onto the bed, sat down, leaned against the sofa, and wrapped her arms around her knees, which she had pulled up to her chest. Before answering, she looked thoughtfully at Bruce. "Come on, Bruce. How many times do we have to go over this? What we have is special. A very special relationship. But no, I don't think it would be better if we got married. Sure, we'd be very happy together, but I also love Mike, and you love Mindy. If we were together, it would only be us. Mike is a very loyal person, and he would never have gotten involved with me if I were married. And I don't think Mindy would have been very happy about that. The truth is, Bruce, people like you and me have a great gift for love. We can love more than one person, and we should love more than one person. It's the right thing to do. But Mindy and Mike aren't like that. Their tendency to limit themselves means they could never do what you and I do. They could never hold back their emotions and make everyone happy." Hearing this, I flew into a rage and threw the press kit against the office door. Because I loved her, or maybe because she was the only woman who had ever loved me, I probably never realized how arrogant, deluded, and selfish my wife was. In her mind, she had somehow turned her infidelity into a virtue. For her, it wasn't a stab in the back to her lawful husband, but something that increased the love in the world. Something she not only had a right to, but in a sense was morally obligated to do. That night, I slept on the couch in my study, and the next morning I prepared the necessary documents. When I returned home the following evening, Olivia greeted me with her hands on her hips and a sour expression on her face. "Where were you last night?" I was terribly worried. "You didn't call, you didn't text, you didn't leave any clues. What the hell?" I stopped her with a raised hand. "I was at work last night. I got drunk and couldn't drive, so I stayed there." She looked at me with complete bewilderment. "Wait, what? You got drunk? At work?" I smiled and nodded at her, and she continued. "Well, you could have at least told me what was going on. I almost called the police. And why the hell were you drinking at work?" She was still looking at me, but her question was filled with utter bewilderment. Without answering, I walked past her into the living room, sank down onto the sofa, put my feet up on the coffee table, placed my briefcase on my knees, and opened it. Olivia, exhaling in exasperation, followed me into the living room and sat down angrily in the armchair opposite the sofa. "Hey, what about Mike's answers?" "Huh? Why did you drink so much at work? What happened last night? What's going on?" I continued rummaging through my briefcase, pulled out a couple of folders, and placed them one after the other on the sofa next to me. "Wait a second, Liv. I want to get this in order." I rummaged through the papers a little more, dangling my legs off the table and leaning forward to put them back in place. I rubbed my hands together as if anticipating a sumptuous dinner, looked at Olivia, and smiled. "Okay, let's get started." "What, let's get started?" "Yes, well, after yesterday." "Yesterday? What happened yesterday?" Olivia's aggressive behavior when I came home quickly changed to a more passive one. I began to feel a slight sense of fear. "Can you at least tell me what you were doing yesterday?" "Oh, yeah. I was watching a video." "What?" "Yeah, I was watching a recording of you and Bruce having fun on the couch in the rec room, and it upset me a little. I guess I had too much to drink." You know, I smiled at Olivia with a thin, insincere smile that mirrored the confusion on her face, which was replaced by shock, fear, and confusion. Her mouth was slightly open and twitching, barely opening and closing, unable to utter a single intelligible sound. Her eyes, wet and increasingly wetter, darted from the papers on the table to the door and back to me, as if she expected someone or something to walk in, clear the papers away, and everything would be fine. Finally, she said, I don't understand, Mike. What are you talking about? Stop it, Olivia. You can't be this stupid. I'm talking about you and Bruce and what you two did yesterday and every damn Tuesday for at least a year. I pointed to the papers in front of me. I'm talking about the end of our marriage. Olivia sighed suddenly and covered her mouth with her hand for a moment. I waited for her to respond. Mike, we can work this out. I think I understand you. Oh, I think I understand you, Liv. I took the DVD out of my briefcase, held it in my hands, and then handed it to her across the table. Last night, I received a lot of information that will help me understand. Indeed, a real goldmine of new facts about my loving wife and friendly brother-in-law. She looked at the DVD as if it were a poisonous snake, recoiling slightly but making no move to take it. Come on, Liv. It's your copy. I won't tell you how I got it, but I have my own to continue studying your philosophy of love and devotion. She leaned forward and started to stand up, and for a moment I thought she was going to come over to me. But I raised my hand and stopped her, and she sat down. She bit her lip for the second, then, looking straight at me, spoke again, slowly and emphatically, with a false confidence that I suspected was meant to hide the tremor in her voice. Mike, listen. You have to open your mind and think about this. It doesn't make sense to ruin your life, our lives, because we have different values and talents. I love you, and I've always been willing to adapt to our differences, and I hope that I interrupted her with a mocking snort. Different values and talents? Seriously, you think cheating on your husband is some kind of talent? Because honestly, Liv, I'm sure everyone does it, seriously. Talent isn't the right word. She took a deep breath, looked up at the ceiling for a moment, then looked back at me. Potential. I think that's the right word. I have an enormous capacity to love, and I can and have successfully loved more than one person at a time. If you throw out outdated ideas about love and relationships, there's no reason why I can't or shouldn't use my potential. Please stop. Honestly, you're just exhausting me with your excuses. I understand that you believe you have some kind of special ability that gives you the right to cheat, lie, and sleep with anyone when you should be faithful. But in reality, these are just stupid excuses, Liv. Anyone can have romantic relationships with more than one person at a time. That doesn't make them lovers with great abilities. It just makes them cheaters. In the blink of an eye, the apologetic and conciliatory Olivia disappeared, replaced by an angry, aggressive, and extremely confident shrew. You're calling me a cheater? She hissed. Well, from your point of view, that's fair enough, I suppose. But on the other hand, I've never lost or suppressed my love for you or Bruce, so I've never betrayed my feelings or compromised because of some medieval code that says I have to limit my relationships to one person. So yes, to you, I may seem like a cheater, but when I look in the mirror, I don't see anything wrong with myself. I have no doubts about what I did, not one. She was breathing heavily. Her face was red. Her eyes were burning, and I dared to challenge her, and I did. Is that how you want to live your life? In an open relationship with lots of different guys loving one today and another tomorrow? Yes, please, to each their own. But pretending that you weren't cheating, that you weren't being dishonest, is a complete lie because you never once let me know that you were having fun with Bruce. And you know damn well that I wouldn't have gone for that. You know that. She sensed my anger and turned away slightly, avoiding my gaze, but I turned so that our eyes met and continued. So you decided to lie and hide the truth. This is the biggest lie I've ever encountered. You made me and almost everyone else think that we were a couple bound exclusively to each other. But you left and started or continued to have fun with Bruce as best you could, hiding your adventures in a cheap furniture store. You lied and lived a lie. And whatever your strange philosophy of marriage may be, it makes you a cheater. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Her lips were tightly pressed together and she slowly shook her head, more in anger than sadness, expressing her disagreement with my words, but apparently unable to find the words to back up her feelings. I continued to stare at her, waiting for a response, but When none came, I ended the confrontation by pulling the documents closer to her. Read this. Get a lawyer. It's fair. Finally, she spoke. What if I don't want a divorce? Then you're out of luck, Liv, because you're going to get one. I paused and added with a poorly concealed smirk. But hey, you won't be alone. That same evening, I moved into an apartment closer to work and very quickly returned to the life I had lived before Olivia, a busy businessman, a loner with no time or desire for socializing. The hours I spent at work became hell, and more than one person noticed. But I knew that if I stayed home, I would think only of Olivia, endlessly dwelling on her affair, wondering if she was thinking about me or having fun with Bruce. I had no choice but to immerse myself in work and try to forget about my marriage as quickly as possible. Usually in any competition, I did whatever it took to win. And I think most people who knew me in the business world expected me to engage in long, drawn-out, and aggressive negotiations to reach an agreement. But that would have meant delays, interaction, and pain. And I was willing to pay to get out of the deal quickly and cleanly. I offered Olivia a large sum of money in exchange for her continued support, threatening to withdraw the offer if she didn't agree to a quick divorce. Deep down, I probably wanted her to object, insist that we could work things out somehow, reject the offer, and fight for the marriage. I wanted that tiny chance of salvation that she believed our marriage had to be more important to her than money. It turned out that it wasn't. After a few half-hearted objections, she agreed to the terms, and 60 days later my marriage was dissolved. A couple of months after the divorce was finalized, Bruce, as expected, began to delay payments. He received appropriate warnings and an unpleasant letter from Bernie stating that we would begin to collect the money by any means necessary. He called and emailed, making excuses and promises, practically begging for more time to pay. I instructed Bernie to take a hard line and made it clear that we would exercise our rights and begin collecting the deposit as soon as legally possible. The day before the practice session, Bruce begged to meet with me in person, and I agreed. At that moment, I realized that he was desperate and willing to do anything to save himself from the wolves, even take money from anyone. I wanted the money to come from Olivia. I looked forward to meeting her. We met in my office after work. Almost all the secretaries had gone home, but my personal assistant, Sherry, remained in the reception area, ready to prepare documents if necessary. Bruce was nervous, more nervous than I had ever seen him. He held out his hand covered in beads of sweat for me to shake as he entered my office uncertainly. Olivia was hiding behind him almost timidly, and I could hardly breathe when I saw her. Olivia was sitting closer to me than to Bruce, wearing one of my favorite dresses, wearing makeup, and smiling her mischievous smile, and I had no doubt that she had come to try to improve Bruce's chances by appealing to my past emotional ties. I suddenly felt an almost irresistible urge to rush over to her, hug and kiss her, but realizing the danger of my feelings, I ruthlessly suppressed this impulse, frowned, and muttered something like a greeting, reluctantly acknowledging her presence. To tell the truth, I was more than surprised that she had come at all. I had been waiting for this meeting for a long time and had carefully thought through how it would go, but I hadn't expected Olivia to be there and was worried that her presence would somehow interfere with my plan to link her to her lovers' failures. I debated whether to object, insist that she wait outside, but in the end decided that her presence might make the outcome more acceptable. Bruce began by trying to charm me. Shaking my hand, he smiled as broadly as he could and made small talk about how he wanted to make things right, wanted me to be happy, and hoped I knew how much he respected me and how sorry he was that things had turned out the way they had. It seemed unbelievable to me that he wanted to renew our friendship, that he thought we could be friends again. I didn't believe him. Without smiling or giving him the slightest encouragement, I stared at him and interrupted him as emotionally as I could. Bruce, that's enough. Your apologies mean nothing to me, is that clear? He leaned back in his chair, pretending I had hit him, then pursed his lips, took a deep breath, and nodded in agreement before starting again. Okay, I'm sorry, Mike. Let's get down to business. He looked at me as if it were my meeting, as if he thought I should continue, but I just spread my arms in anticipation and waited for him to state his point. He nervously licked his lips and ran a trembling hand through his hair, then began to tell me that he intended to pay me back, but at the moment, he was a little short. He told me that Bernie was playing hardball and expressed doubt that I knew how much pressure he was putting on him to pay. He then went on to tell me that the business was on the verge of recovery, and that a little more time, would allow him to get out of debt. Finally, he tried to argue that I would be better off financially if I gave him more time. I leaned back in my chair, watching Bruce's nervous smile, the thin film of sweat on his forehead, and the poorly controlled tremor of his right hand resting on the table between us. Bruce, if you weren't such a blatant liar, I might consider extending your contract. His eyes widened in surprise and fear, and he leaned forward, about to protest, but I stopped him with a raised hand. Come on, Bruce. You have to understand that it's almost impossible to trust a man who has no qualms about entertaining his married sister-in-law. You have to understand that asking the husband of that woman for financial help is ridiculous. Bruce shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Olivia cleared her throat nervously and said plaintively, Mike, please, you can't punish Bruce because I can do whatever I want, Olivia, I snapped, giving her a look full of obvious hostility. And what are you doing here anyway? I thought I could win you back for old time's sake. I still love you and thought that… I interrupted her sharply and loudly. You were wrong. To be honest, your presence only reminds me of how Bruce, figuratively speaking, did this to me by literally doing it to you. So do yourself and Bruce a favor. Sit down, try to look pretty, and keep your comments to an absolute minimum. Tears welled up in her eyes and her chin began to quiver, but she did as I insisted and leaned back in her chair. I turned back to Bruce. Okay, Bruce, here's the deal. You pay on time according to a strict schedule, or I'll start the process to get everything I can from the collateral. Bruce shook his head aggressively. Come on, Mike. You can't take my business away from me. You can't. I can, and I will if you don't pay, Bruce. My advice is to get the money, ask your family, find a bank, sell something. I don't care. Just get the money, or I'll take what I can get. But the banks won't give me a loan. Otherwise, I would have gone to them first. And my family can't help. They don't have that kind of money. I looked Bruce straight in the eye. Don't tell me your family doesn't have money. I know they do. No. They would help if they could, but they just can't. What about her? I pointed at Olivia. Did you ask her for money? Bruce sat back down. Liv? Liv doesn't have… I laughed. Of course she does. I wrote her a check for $150,000. She's loaded. What about you, Olivia? I grinned at Olivia, and Bruce looked at her questioningly. As I suspected, he didn't know about the lump sum payment. She suddenly became nervous, maybe even a little nauseous. Yes, I know, but I need that money. I laughed again. Wow, Liv, I remember how you thought it was safe to give Bruce money when you were trying to convince me to help you. So why are you hesitating now? Aren't you confident in Bruce's ability to turn your business around? Don't you want to help convince me that he'll pay you back? If you think it's a good investment for me, why not for you? I looked at her with an expectant, wicked grin. She swallowed hard, looked at Bruce, then back at me. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and said defiantly that she could definitely cover the difference for the time being. Bruce smiled at her. She smiled weakly back, and they left. Bruce with more confidence, Olivia with her shoulders slumped in disappointment. Opening the door for them, I left them with one last warning. Remember, Bruce, I don't care how. I just want my money. You'll get your money, he threw back at me. Olivia looked worried. Over the next few months, I continued to seek solace in my work. Businesslike and efficient with everyone, I still avoided personal conversations at all costs, completely shutting myself off from any social contact, preferring to work or be alone. I tried desperately not to think about my wife's betrayal and infidelity, but everything reminded me of her. Even, of course, the monthly check from Bruce that appeared on my desk. The check brought me some bitter satisfaction, a feeling that I had somehow managed to drag the culprits of my misfortune down with me. The situation got a little worse when Mindy contacted me. She emailed me several times and even called me on the phone. I was quite surprised to learn that Bruce and Olivia had confessed to her, undoubtedly in a watered-down version of their affair, and that she had taken it quite hard at first but had ultimately forgiven them both. To my disappointment and horror, she hinted that she had guessed about their affair and that they had come to some kind of agreement whereby Bruce and Olivia were continuing to see each other. She even made a half-serious attempt to persuade me to take Olivia back. I responded sharply and bitterly, and I was sure that by the end of the second conversation she was in tears, after which I heard nothing more from her. Mindy's apparent tolerance made it clear that the emotional price Bruce and Olivia had paid was much less than I had hoped. I was very afraid that somehow the store would become profitable, Bruce would pay off his debt, Olivia would get her money, and they would all be happy, both financially and emotionally, and they would leave me behind. collectively pointing the finger at the poor wretch who just couldn't understand what modern love was all about. I shouldn't have worried. The furniture warehouse burned to the ground 9 months after I met Bruce and Olivia. It was an impressive fire that threatened neighboring buildings and made the evening news. I didn't see the report, but Bernie did, and he called me right away to discuss the aftermath. He was furious that I had taken such a risk, as he was certain that the trust had flushed a considerable amount of money down the toilet. I calmed him down by promising to personally buy out the loan obligations in the event of default and assuring him that the property itself had value simply because of its location. Obvious questions were asked about the fire, and when the catalytic converters were discovered, the insurance company immediately refused to pay out. With no income from the store, Bruce paid off the loan in full, and I bought the smoldering ruins of the building and 35 acres of duck hunting land on the Mississippi. The criminal investigation lasted nearly 6 months. Detectives gathered fairly strong circumstantial evidence against Bruce and Olivia. They were able to prove that the store was losing money and that Olivia was putting more and more money into it every month to keep it afloat. Bruce made several desperate attempts to obtain loans from other sources but failed, and then, as quietly as possible, made a final attempt to sell the business, but no buyers were found, even at a clearly reduced price. Investigators found no evidence that Olivia or Bruce were near the store on the night of the fire or that they had purchased anything to set it on fire or accelerate the burning, but their case was based on the theory that they had hired a professional to set the store on fire. Numerous search queries containing the word arson were found on Olivia's home computer, along with records of phone calls with at least 2 men convicted of arson, and evidence that she had withdrawn $15,000 in cash a week before the fire. Olivia and Bruce had good lawyers, no doubt hired with the money they had left, and the prosecutor, realizing he had an uphill battle ahead of him, began to make deals. I believe they initially charged them with arson and first-degree fraud, and then made concessions. The defense wouldn't agree to anything less than fourth-degree arson, and a game of brinkmanship began over the trial date. I was put on the witness list, and on the first day of the trial I waited in the lobby. I sat on a hard wooden bench reading the newspaper and tapping my foot absently on the tile floor when the bailiff came out and announced that the trial had been canceled, that they had finally reached an agreement and everyone could go home. As I was about to leave, Olivia and Bruce entered the courtroom accompanied by several officers and their lawyer. Several reporters rushed up to them and shoved microphones in their faces, but they refused to comment, and the reporters turned their attention to the lawyer. Bruce turned to Mindy and left the courtroom accompanied by several officers, but Olivia looked in my direction and without hesitation came over to talk to me. I must admit that in that situation I admired her courage. "Well, Mike, is this your lucky day? Is this what you wanted, for me to be punished for my sins?" I laughed bitterly and shook my head mockingly. "I wanted a faithful wife and a happy marriage. I never got what I wanted from you. If it weren't for that, I would only want my money back." She snorted. "Well, now you won't get any of that, will you?" "Oh, I got some of the money back and took the store." She laughed. "And what are you going to do with it? Has it quit smoking yet? You'd be surprised what a competent businessman with good real estate can do, even if it smokes." Her nostrils flared and her face hardened a little. She took a deep breath and paused before speaking again. "And you're happier now? Alone? With no one? Married to your job for the foreseeable future?" She gave me a meaningful smile. "Don't deny it, I know you. I know how much you hate meeting new people. I'm working on it, Liv. I fell in love with you, but you're not the only woman in the world, you know that." She smiled confidently. "No, I'm not the only one. But I don't think you'll be able to find, what do you business people call it? An equivalent replacement? Whether you like it or not, I'm going to miss you." I leaned toward her and whispered in her ear. "I may be a little lonely, but you won't be, right? The good news is that you'll be living in a close circle of androgynous women with whom you can share all your love. It'll be good for you, and good for lesbians." Olivia surprised me by suddenly losing her composure after my last remark, recoiling from me as if I were a radioactive source, her face contorted with contempt and her eyes flashing with anger. She took a deep breath, her chest rising aggressively several times, and then she exploded. "You're a damn hypocritical, selfish, emotional dwarf," she screamed as the police dragged her away from me toward the door. "You'll end up in the same hole as me, alone with no one. Married to your damn job." I watched her scream at me. Her love for me completely evaporated, leaving only contemptuous hatred. And I was overcome by a sudden wave of melancholy. I fought the urge to react in a way that would betray my pain, smiled through gritted teeth, and muttered something about her using rather offensive language in public. But she just continued her tirade as if I hadn't said a word. But soon I'll be out of my prison and starting a new life. And you'll be left alone, dreaming of being with me. And in a few years, when you marry some boring ex-secretary, you'll still regret saying yes. The door closed behind her, suddenly interrupting her tirade. I turned and left the courtroom. I had no business at the courthouse after lunch, and now, with no appointments and struggling with a growing sense of despondency and loneliness, I walked out into the deserted parking lot and thought about my life. The temperature had dropped, and the wind continued to whip my jacket and burn my face as I looked around, still wondering what to do with the wreckage. I wasn't sure I could salvage the situation, and I was inclined to sell everything, forget about the loss, and focus on what I had always done. It was a safe decision, perhaps even a wise one, but I knew there was another option. I could take a risk and rebuild everything, maybe even open another furniture store. I thought about the possibility of successfully selling furniture in the same place where Bruce had failed. I thought about making it a big event, with lots of advertising, billboards, maybe even TV commercials that Bruce and my ex wouldn't be able to miss. I could even call it Olivia's and have lots of hot sales. It occurred to me that the decisions I was making about the plot were similar to the decisions I had been making unconsciously in my life in general. Olivia was right about me. My natural inclination, and before I met her, my only inclination toward communication was to withdraw, avoid the risk of intimacy, and focus on work. I could see myself inexorably approaching a lonely life, financially secure but relatively joyless. I was becoming the person I was meant to be, doing what was safe. I sat down on a concrete block and looked around once more, still weighing my options, still thinking about my future. I was stuck between my fears and desires, between the ingrained habits that served me and defined me, and the desire to change, to become someone else. I was about to leave and go back to work, let go of the idea and put it off until another day, when suddenly a few rays of late sun broke through the clouds in between the buildings, illuminating a graffiti-covered wall across the street. The light painted the wall bright orange, giving the concrete and the writing a glowing appearance. The words were written in bold white letters, clear and easy to read. Act. I had always looked down on superstitious people and how they let unimportant, objectively meaningless things control their lives in the form of signs or habits. But here, sitting on a concrete slab in the November cold, those words seemed like destiny, a message from God. I took out my cell phone and called the office, asking for my assistant. Sherry, who is the architectural firm that designed the new shopping center that everyone is talking about? The one with the glass and fountains. Hammer, I think. She hummed softly as she checked. Yes, Hammerstone. Looks like they're based here in Chicago. Okay, listen. Can you set up a meeting for me as soon as possible? She hesitated for a second. Are we building something? I looked around the lot, imagining the new store, and suddenly felt a rush of confidence. Yes, I think so. Okay. Sure, boss. Anything else? I bit my lip, staring again at the graffiti across the street and reading the call to action. Yes, Sherry, there's something else. Do you know the jeans representative, the tall blonde, Brenda? Brenda White, I think. Yes. Sherry's voice was becoming increasingly skeptical, and I wondered if she suspected me of something. Can you give me her number? Sure, boss. Should I transfer you? No, I'll call her myself. Thanks. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for the next video.